May the 4th, 1945. If General George Smith Patton had been allowed to advance just 60 more miles, Prague would have been liberated by the United States Army. 41 years of communist darkness would never have happened. Millions of people would have lived in freedom instead of tyranny. But with the capital of Czechoslovakia broadcasting desperate pleas for help, with Czech fighters dying in the streets, with German forces collapsing, the man they called Old Blood and Guts received an order that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Halt. Do not advance east of Pilsen. They called him Old Blood and Guts, a name earned through years of leading from the front, charging into battle while other generals commanded from behind the lines. General George Smith Patton had just crushed the Third Reich across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. His Third Army was the most feared combat force in Europe. The Germans would rather surrender to anyone else. The Russians respected him. Even Winston Churchill wanted him unleashed. Now he sat 50 miles from Prague. His tanks could reach the city in 4 hours. Radio broadcasts in broken English begged the Americans to save them. Czech resistance fighters were dying by the hundreds, and Old Blood and Guts was ordered to stop. This is the story of the decision that changed the fate of millions. This is what happened next. Spring of 1945. The Third Reich was collapsing. From the west, the United States Army drove deep into Germany. From the east, the Soviet Red Army smashed toward Berlin. General George Smith Patton's Third Army swept through Bavaria like a hurricane. Nothing could stop them. The original plan did not include Czechoslovakia. Old Blood and Guts had received orders to drive toward the mountainous region between Bavaria and Austria, toward something intelligence called the Alpine Fortress. Nazi propaganda claimed that Adolf Hitler's elite forces would make their final stand there, die-hard SS troops, secret weapons, a last desperate defense that could cost tens of thousands of United States lives. George Smith Patton prepared his divisions to storm the mountains. His Dorondi Corps, his V Corps, his XX Corps, battle-hardened divisions that had fought across Europe, the 2nd Infantry Division, the 16th Armored Division, the 97th Infantry Division, the 4th Armored Division, more than 300,000 soldiers, 4,000 tanks. The most powerful striking force ever assembled. But as his reconnaissance units pushed south, they discovered something that changed everything. The Alpine Fortress did not exist. It was a myth. Nazi propaganda. There was no fortress, no elite troops, no secret weapons. The Germans in the south were finished, demoralized, desperate to surrender, fleeing west to avoid capture by the Russians. General George Smith Patton saw an opportunity. His intelligence officers spread maps across the hood of his command vehicle. To the east lay Czechoslovakia, Czech territory, an ally, a nation that had suffered 6 years under Nazi occupation. And according to the maps, according to reconnaissance reports, according to basic military logic, there was almost nothing between his current position and the Czech border. "We can be in Czechoslovakia in 24 hours, Patton told his staff. Old Blood and Guts was right. On April the 19th, 1945, advance elements of the United States Third Army crossed into Czechoslovakia near the town of Osh. Czech journalist Zdeněk Vršovský, traveling with the Americans, sent a report to the BBC. "It is Thursday, 19th of April, 1945. Today we are going to tread Czechoslovak soil again, after 6 years. We are driving through Bavarian villages and towns. It is a beautiful sunny day, and not far ahead of us appear the peaks of the Czech mountains." The locals stared in shock. German-speaking residents of the Sudetenland, the border region that Nazi Germany had annexed in 1938, suddenly understood that their occupation was over. A German policeman with a white armband timidly approached the American vehicles. When he saw the shoulder patches that read Czechoslovakia on Czech liaison officers, his face went pale. He measured the distance with his steps and stopped about 20 meters down the hill, Vršovský reported. Then he explained, "The border is here. We are in Czechoslovakia on this side, and Deutschland is on the other side." That man spoke in the present tense, having understood that the time has come to reconcile himself with the existence of the Czechoslovak Republic. On his pale, frightened face, I could read a great worry. The Czechs are here. What will happen now? What would happen now was that old blood and guts was coming, and nothing had ever stopped him before. But General George Smith Patton did not command the Allied forces in Europe. That authority belonged to General Dwight David Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Expeditionary Forces, and Eisenhower had to think about more than just military objectives. He had to think about politics, about diplomacy, about the alliance with the Soviet Union. The Soviets had fought the Germans for nearly 4 years. They had lost more than 20 million people. They had bled across Eastern Europe. And now, in May of 1945, they were closing in on Berlin and preparing operations into Czechoslovakia. General Eisenhower and the Soviet command had already agreed on demarcation lines, boundaries that would separate United States and Soviet forces to prevent accidental clashes. Initially, Eisenhower agreed with Soviet General Alexei Antonov that United States forces would halt on a line from Karlovy Vary to Plzeň to České Budějovice. In English, Carlsbad to Pilsen to Budweis. Patton hated it, old blood and guts, wanted to keep driving east. Winston Churchill agreed with him. The British Prime Minister urged Eisenhower to push deeper into Czechoslovakia, to reach Prague before the Soviets. Churchill understood what was coming, that whoever liberated Prague would control the country's future. On May the 4th, 1945, Eisenhower reconsidered. He sent another message to General Antonov. He asked, not announced, but asked, for permission to advance beyond the agreed line, to push along the Vltava River toward Prague. General George Smith Patton was ecstatic. Finally he could finish the job. His divisions could reach Prague in 1 day, maybe 2. The Germans between Pilsen and Prague were scattered, disorganized, desperate to surrender. There was no real resistance. It would not even be a battle. It would be a liberation march. "We can be in Prague by tomorrow night," Patton told General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group and Patton's immediate superior. Bradley was cautious. Wait for Ike's final orders. Those orders came the next day, May the 5th, 1945. General Antonov replied to Eisenhower's request. He protested that the Prague offensive by the Red Army had already started. He warned that United States and Soviet forces might accidentally clash. He insisted that American forces must not advance beyond the Carlsbad-Pilsen-Budweis line. What Antonov did not tell Eisenhower, what the Soviet command deliberately concealed, was that the Prague offensive had not actually started yet. Soviet forces were still taking up positions around Dresden, more than 70 miles north of Prague. The offensive would not begin until May the 7th, 2 days later. But Eisenhower believed his ally. He sent orders to Bradley. Bradley sent orders to Patton. Halt at Pilsen. Do not advance east of the demarcation line. General George Smith Patton exploded. He called Bradley repeatedly. He sent messages to Eisenhower. He argued, he pleaded, he demanded. Old blood and guts had spent 5 years fighting across 2 continents for this moment. His Third Army had liberated France, had crossed the Rhine in 24 hours, had smashed into Germany, had reached Czechoslovakia ahead of schedule. And now, with Prague just 60 miles away, with victory within reach, he was ordered to stop. "We're the ones who fought our way here," Patton raged to his staff. "We're the ones who bled for this, and now we're supposed to sit here and wait while the Russians take Prague? It's political cowardice." But orders were orders. Even old blood and guts could not defy the Supreme Commander, or could he? On May the 5th, 1945, General George Smith Patton's Third Army liberated the city of Pilsen. The 16th Armored Division rolled into the city at 8 o'clock in the evening of May the 6th. Czech citizens poured into the streets. They cheered, they waved flags, they threw flowers at the tanks, they kissed American soldiers. After 6 years of Nazi occupation, after 6 years of fear and oppression and death, they were free. But 60 miles to the east, in Prague, people were not free. They were dying. On May the 5th, the same day Eisenhower ordered Patton to halt, the citizens of Prague rose up against their Nazi occupiers. The Prague Uprising, spontaneous, desperate, brave beyond measure. Czech resistance fighters built barricades in the streets. They overturned streetcars. They ripped up cobblestones. They piled furniture and trash cans across intersections. They fought with hunting rifles, with pistols, with whatever weapons they could find. Young men and women who had never been soldiers charged SS troops who had fought across Europe. It was a massacre. The Germans had tanks, artillery, machine guns, professional soldiers. The Czechs had courage and nothing else. Hundreds died in the first hours. Blood ran in the streets, buildings burned. And from the studios of Czechoslovak Radio Prague, desperate broadcasters sent appeals in broken English. Calling all American forces, calling General Patton. We need help. We are fighting. Please come. The Germans are killing us. Please. In Pilsen, American soldiers listened to these broadcasts. They heard the gunfire in the background. They heard the desperation in the voices. They heard people dying in real time. General George Smith Patton heard it too. Old blood and guts stood in his headquarters, hands clenched, jaw tight, listening to Czechs begging the United States to save them. He knew he could do it. 4 hours. That is all it would take. Load his tanks, drive east, smash through whatever German resistance remained, and reach Prague by midnight. He called Bradley again. Give me permission, just say yes. I can have tanks in Prague tonight. George, you have your orders. Eisenhower is working with the Soviets. You cannot cross that line. Then let me send a reconnaissance force. Not an invasion, just intelligence gathering. We need to know what's between us and Prague. Bradley hesitated. A reconnaissance mission. Not an attack. Not a liberation. Just gathering intelligence. Keep it small, Bradley finally said. And George, do not start a war. Patton did not need to be told twice. He already had a mission prepared. Within hours, a small team left Pilsen heading east toward Prague. 1 American officer. 3 Czechoslovak soldiers who had fought with the British Army and were now attached to Patton's Third Army. They traveled on motorcycles, fast, quiet, moving through the night. They passed through German lines undetected. The Wehrmacht soldiers were confused, exhausted, leaderless. Most did not even challenge the motorcycle patrol. Those who noticed assumed they were German couriers. The Americans and Czechs drove straight through, behind enemy lines, or what was supposed to be enemy lines. They found chaos, German units retreating westward, soldiers throwing away weapons, officers burning documents, no organized defense, no prepared positions. The road to Prague was wide open. By dawn of May the 6th, the reconnaissance team reached the outskirts of Prague. They drove into a war zone. Barricades blocked every major street. Gunfire echoed from all directions. Bodies lay in intersections. Buildings smoldered. Czech fighters, teenagers, factory workers, students, fired at German positions with rifles that had been hidden for 6 years. Czechs were shooting at Germans with hunting rifles and pistols, one of the Czech soldiers later recalled. Czechs were dying for nothing because there was no resistance between Pilsen and Prague, and we could have driven out the Germans in a day. The team made contact with the Czech resistance headquarters on Bartolomějská Street in central Prague. The resistance leaders were desperate. "Where is General Patton?" they demanded. "Where is the United States Army? We heard the broadcasts. You promised to help." "General Patton is in Pilsen," the American officer explained. "He has been ordered not to advance beyond the demarcation line. The Soviet army is supposed to liberate Prague." "The Soviets?" The Czech fighters looked at each other. "Where are they? We are dying now, not tomorrow, now." The truth was that the Soviet forces were still more than 60 miles away, fighting toward Prague from the northeast. They would not arrive for 2 more days. The Prague uprising would have to survive on its own. The American reconnaissance team offered to take someone from the resistance leadership back to Pilsen to meet with Patton directly. Surely if old blood and guts heard first-hand testimony of what was happening, surely Eisenhower would reconsider. But the communist members of the resistance, already the dominant political force, refused. They understood the political implications. If the United States liberated Prague, the Western powers would have influence over post-war Czechoslovakia. If the Soviets liberated Prague, the Communist Party would control the country's future. They were willing to let hundreds die to ensure Soviet liberation. The American team returned to Pilsen empty-handed. When they reported to Patton, old blood and guts slammed his fist on the table. "God damn it, we're sitting here. They're dying there. And politics keeps us from doing our job." But there was one more soldier who refused to accept the order to halt. One Czech soldier, serving with the British forces but temporarily attached to the United States Third Army, who decided that orders be damned. He was going to fight for his country. His name was Rudolph. He had fought at Tobruk, at Dunkirk, on D-Day. He had survived 5 years of war with one goal, to liberate Czechoslovakia. And now, 60 miles from his homeland, he was told to wait while his countrymen died. "We have to get to Prague and help our countrymen," Rudolph announced to 5 Czech soldiers from his platoon. "How are we going to do that?" one asked. "Watch me." Rudolph stole a United States Army truck. He and his colleagues loaded it with weapons and ammunition. With Rudolph at the wheel, they sped east on the highway toward Prague. Czech citizens, seeing the white star painted on the green vehicle, cheered madly as they passed through town after town. The road was clear. The Germans did not stop them. Victory was minutes away, until they reached Berun, less than 20 miles from Prague. There, across the highway, stood a barricade, not German, Soviet. Red Army soldiers with rifles pointed at the American truck. An advance unit of Soviet forces had reached Berun ahead of the main Soviet army and blocked the road. Rudolph and his men argued in Czech. The Russians responded in Russian. Neither group fully understood the other, but the message was clear. The Soviets would not let them pass. Not today, not tomorrow, not until the Red Army officially liberated Prague. After an hour of fruitless attempts, even offers of bribes, Rudolph turned the truck around. They drove back to Pilsen. He had stolen United States property. He had disobeyed orders. He had crossed the demarcation line. He expected to be arrested. But when Rudolph sought out an American lieutenant colonel, he had befriended and confessed everything. The officer just smiled sadly. "Good try, Rudy. I would have done the same thing if I'd been in your shoes. I'm sorry you didn't make it through. Just return the truck and the weapons where you found them. It never happened." Because dozens of American officers felt the same way Rudolph did. They knew they could save Prague. They knew hundreds were dying. And they knew that Old Blood and Guts wanted nothing more than to unleash his Third Army one last time. On the night of May the 7th to May the 8th, 1945, General George Smith Patton made one final appeal to General Eisenhower. Prague radio was still broadcasting. The uprising was entering its third day. The Germans were still shooting, despite the unconditional surrender, signed at Reims, France on May the 7th. Czech fighters were running out of ammunition, running out of hope. "Send me in," Patton demanded. "The war is officially over. Germany has surrendered. I'm not starting a conflict. I'm enforcing the surrender. The Germans in Prague are violating the armistice. Let me go in and finish this." For several hours, Eisenhower and his staff seriously discussed sending an armored task force to Prague. Not the entire Third Army, just one powerful column, tanks and infantry, fast-moving. They could reach Prague by morning, crush remaining German resistance, save the uprising, and establish United States presence before Soviet forces arrived. General George Smith Patton waited by the radio. His division commanders waited. Tank crews sat in their vehicles, engines idling, infantry loaded into trucks. Old Blood and Guts had never been this close to openly defying orders. He was prepared to apologize later, after Prague was liberated, after Czech lives were saved, after history was changed. Then the reports came in. Soviet forces had reached the suburbs of Prague. The Red Army was moving toward the center. If the Americans advanced now, the two armies would meet in the city. The risk of friendly fire was too great. The risk of a diplomatic catastrophe, of a rupture in the alliance, was unacceptable. The order was final. Halt at Pilsen. The Red Army will liberate Prague. On May the 9th, 1945, Soviet forces entered Prague. The Czech resistance fighters, those who survived, greeted them as liberators. The Communist Party immediately began consolidating power. Within 3 years, Czechoslovakia would become a Soviet satellite state. Democracy would die. Freedom would die. For 41 years, the Czech and Slovak people would live under totalitarian rule, all because General George Smith Patton was ordered to stop 60 miles short of Prague. After the war ended, the truth emerged. Soviet General Antonov had lied. The Prague offensive had not started when he told Eisenhower it had. Soviet forces were not ready to move toward Prague until May the 7th, 2 full days after Antonov warned about accidental clashes. If Eisenhower had announced instead of asked, If he had simply informed the Soviets that United States forces were advancing, Patton's Third Army would have reached Prague first. George Smith Patton never forgave Eisenhower for the decision. Old blood and guts understood what the historians would later confirm. The liberation of Prague by Soviet forces directly enabled communist domination of Czechoslovakia. The Czech people, grateful to the Red Army for their liberation, initially supported closer ties with the Soviet Union. That gratitude gave the Communist Party political legitimacy, and that legitimacy eventually destroyed Czech democracy. In February of 1948, the Communist Party seized complete control of Czechoslovakia in a coup. Opponents were arrested, exiled, or executed. The country became a totalitarian state. Freedom of speech vanished. Freedom of assembly vanished. Political prisoners filled the jails. Show trials executed innocent people. For 4 decades, Czechoslovakia lived in darkness. Patton saw it coming. In the months after the war, Old Blood and Guts became increasingly vocal about the Soviet threat. He argued that the United States should maintain strong military forces in Europe. He warned that the Soviets intended to dominate Eastern Europe. He even suggested, controversially, that the Western Allies should prepare for possible conflict with the Soviet Union while their armies were still mobilized. His superiors considered him a warmonger, a political liability. In September of 1945, General Eisenhower relieved George Smith Patton of command of the Third Army. Old Blood and Guts was reassigned to command the 15th Army, a headquarters unit with no combat troops, a desk job, a humiliation. 3 months later, on December the 9th, 1945, General George Smith Patton was critically injured in a traffic accident near Mannheim, Germany. On December the 21st, 1945, he died. He was 60 years old. Many who knew him believed that Patton died of a broken heart as much as from his injuries. The greatest combat commander in United States history, the man they called Old Blood and Guts, spent his final months sidelined and censored, while the world he had fought to save slipped toward the Cold War. But what if? What if Eisenhower had announced instead of asked? What if Patton had been unleashed on May the 5th? What if the Third Army had rolled into Prague ahead of the Red Army? Czechoslovakia might have remained a democracy. The communist coup of 1948 might never have happened. The Iron Curtain might have been drawn further east. Millions of Czechs and Slovaks might have lived in freedom instead of under Soviet occupation. Military historians today study the decision to halt at Pilsen as one of the most consequential orders of World War II. Not because of military implications, the war in Europe was already won, but because of political implications that would shape the next half-century. General George Smith Patton understood this. Old Blood and Guts knew that wars are not won just on battlefields. They are won by holding the ground you have taken, by securing strategic positions, by understanding that political consequences matter as much as military victories. In Pilsen today, there is an annual liberation festival every May. Czech citizens remember the United States Third Army. They remember General George Smith Patton. They remember that American soldiers liberated their city while Prague fell under Soviet control. And they wonder, like historians wonder, like Patton wondered in his final months, what might have been different if Old Blood and Guts had been allowed to drive those final 60 miles. This is why they called him Old Blood and Guts. Not just because General George Smith Patton was brave, not just because he led from the front, not just because he won battles. They called him Old Blood and Guts because he understood what war was really about. It was not about glory or medals or newspapers. It was about protecting freedom, about saving lives, about ensuring that the soldiers who died fighting tyranny did not die in vain. George Smith Patton wanted to liberate Prague not for personal glory, not to add another city to his list of conquests. He wanted to liberate Prague because people were dying, because he could stop the dying, because his Third Army, the army, that had smashed across France and Germany without ever retreating, without ever failing, was ready and capable and desperate to finish the job. And he was ordered to stop. Military historians still debate whether Eisenhower made the right decision. Some argue that maintaining the alliance with the Soviet Union was more important than the liberation of one city. Others argue that Eisenhower should have understood the political implications, that Prague was not just one city, but the key to Central Europe's future. But there is no debate about what General George Smith Patton would have done. Old blood and guts would have driven those 60 miles. He would have reached Prague in 4 hours. He would have saved the uprising. He would have changed history. That is why the United States military still studies George Smith Patton, not just his tactics, not just his bold maneuvers and rapid advances, but his understanding that military decisions have political consequences, that liberating a city matters less than what happens after liberation, that the soldiers who fight and bleed and die deserve to see their sacrifices create lasting freedom, not temporary victories followed by decades of oppression. Today in the Czech Republic, people remember. Every year they celebrate the liberation of Pilsen by the United States Third Army. They wave American flags. They thank the veterans who freed them. And quietly, sadly, they remember that Prague was liberated by different forces, and that difference shaped their history for 41 years. The man they called Old Blood and Guts became a legend not because he won every battle, though he did. Not because he never retreated, though he never did. George Smith Patton became a legend because he fought for something bigger than victory. He fought for freedom, for democracy, for the belief that liberated people should remain free. When he reached Czechoslovakia in May of 1945, Old Blood and Guts saw beyond the immediate military situation. He saw the future. He saw what would happen if Prague fell to Soviet control. He tried to prevent it. He begged for permission. He argued. He pleaded. And he was ordered to stop. That order haunted him until he died 7 months later. That order changed the fate of millions. That order drew the Iron Curtain across Europe and condemned Czechoslovakia to decades of darkness. But the legend of George Smith Patton lives on. In military academies where officers study his campaigns. In Pilsen, where they celebrate liberation every May. In the hearts of everyone who believes that freedom is worth fighting for. And that sometimes the greatest tragedies are not defeats on the battlefield, but victories that could have been. This is why they called him Old Blood and Guts. This is why General George Smith Patton remains the greatest combat commander in United States history. This is why we remember him. If this story of how Old Blood and Guts reached Czechoslovakia and was ordered to stop just 60 miles from Prague moved you, hit subscribe. We are bringing you more untold moments from General George Smith Patton's legendary career. More stories of impossible victories. More tales of the man who never accepted defeat. More chapters from the life of Old Blood and Guts, the general who changed history. Because the world needs to remember. Not just what happened, but what could have happened. Not just the victories we achieved, but the victories we were denied. Not just the legend of George Smith Patton, but the warning his story still holds today. Never stop 60 miles short of freedom. Never halt when victory is within reach. Never let politics prevent you from finishing the mission. That is the lesson of May 1945. That is the legacy of Old Blood and Guts. That is why we still tell his story today.